Today on Landry.Audio, we've got veteran fighter Rich Franklin. If you're an old school fan like myself, you'll remember him as one of the Millitech Fighting System boys who split his time between fighting and being a high school teacher before going on to become the middleweight champion of the world. He ended up losing that belt to Henderson Silva, which brought in the Brazilian's reign, but it gave Rich the opportunity to move around in weight classes where he started taking on some of the most exciting super fights of the era with guys like Dan Henderson, Wanderlei Silva, and Chuck Liddell. Now retired, he's relocated from the Midwest of America to Singapore, where he's the vice president of the recently renamed One Championship, which is Asia's largest fighting organization. And in addition to his already amazing legacy, if you're watching UFC 236 this weekend, it was announced that Rich will be the next inductee into the UFC Hall of Fame. So, Rich, congratulations, and thanks for chatting with us today.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate it. I don't think the gravity of the induction the news of it has quite hit me yet. So it's exciting news, though, to know that would be kind of the capstone of my career, so to speak.
So how does this happen? I've heard about guys not knowing and they only find out on the broadcast. Were you informed beforehand?
I was about 2 weeks, maybe 2 weeks prior to the broadcast. Dana reached out to me and told me that they were going to induct me this year. And it's been several years since I retired, so I was a bit surprised on several levels. It was just, it's quite the surprise to get a phone call like that to know that that's the direction that they're moving in as far as their inductions. And so, yeah, excited and surprised, I guess, would be the two adjectives that would best describe me that day.
Well, it's very well deserved, and glad to see you in there, and finally nice to see some of these guys from that era who are getting their just desserts these days.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, man.
So, look, for a lot of people that are listening, they remember, Rich Franklin as I mentioned, as the guy from that sort of golden era of the UFC. I think, if I'm not mistaken, your career really springboarded off headlining The Ultimate Fighter, where you were fighting Ken Shamrock. And then, of course, you announced your retirement, and you're doing more work online these days, and you've relocated to Asia. So do you want to sort of take us through what happened to you after fighting and how you've taken on the role now with One?
Yeah, I think, I think what has happened to me post athletic career kind of ties into it ties deeply into my athletic career, because what you said about the golden era of that time, when I was competing at that time, mixed martial arts in the U.S., the UFC, they weren't doing that many shows a year. And so if you had a show in March, a pay-per-view in March, for example, your next pay-per-view may not be till June. Well, if I was headlining the June card, you would hear nothing but my name all the way from March until June. When they were advertising on television. Of course, this is about the time that everything started broadcasting on Spike in the U.S., and so it was good exposure. It was good exposure at the time, and there weren't that many events. Of course, now, and you and I were talking prior to the interview about how in the industry of mixed martial arts, it's easy to get lost anymore because there are so many athletes. The rosters for these organizations are huge, and they're doing so many different cards that you get to a point where you can only keep track of your favorites. It's hard to keep track of an entire roster. And I think I competed at a time where the fans, particularly the hardcore fans, could probably name every single athlete on the roster at that time. And so it really helped me develop a brand for myself personally. I think when people think of a brand of my own, they would think of some hard work would come to mind. And so that's what I am about in real life. And I think that brand that I created helped carry me into the position I have here at One Championship. And so I'm on this side of the planet. Within that organization, I run my own project. It's called One Warrior Series. I have an amazing team that runs with me. And basically I travel around I would say the region, but we've gone as far as New Zealand now, and that's quite some distance, and we're ever expanding. But we travel around the region, and I recruit talent. I recruit talent for my own organization. We do our own events, and then these athletes that I recruit, they compete for a 6-figure contract for One Championship. And I've already had, I want to say, 7 athletes that have graduated into One Championship earned contracts so far. And so in the process of recruitment, I travel around with a production team, and we make content out of the recruitment process. So I'll essentially go and pick I'll pick up an athlete, and from that athlete, we'll learn their backstory, and then take them to do something fun, something that's culturally related, relevant to the area that they're from, and just basically begin building a profile on them.
Yeah, I was watching the one series that you did in Sydney, because I'm located up in Newcastle, which is that Hunter region where you guys were doing all that off-roading activity. That's about 30 minutes from my door, and as we mentioned pre-interview, you guys have signed on with a couple of guys that I train with and know fairly well. What was have you been down to Australia, and what were your impressions of the country coming down?
No, I haven't. I haven't been to Australia. This is my first time there. And interestingly enough, I always kept saying that I wasn't going to spend my own money to go to Australia, because eventually I figured work would take me there. There were a couple times where there was a possibility that I could compete there, and it ended up the way that contracts go and negotiations and all that kind of stuff. You end up on different cards. So I never ended up competing in Australia. But that's what I always said, like, nah, I'll eventually get paid to go, so I'm going to hold off. And that's what ended up happening. So it was my first time there. And when I go to a new country, I typically assess it on two different levels. Like, the first level is, what if I'm, looking at a place, I think, could I live in a place like this? And Australia is one of those places that I could consider living. It's a very healthy environment. It's outdoorsy. There are a lot of things to do. We were, of course, while I was in Australia, we did the off-roading that you saw in the episode, but we also spent some time at Manly Beach, played some volleyball. I went hang gliding while I was down there, and then we spent some time canyoning through Blue Mountains. Yes. Yeah. And so, I look at something like that, and these are the kind of things that I would be interested in doing in my daily life. I'm from the Midwest in the States, so I'm big into outdoors things, like having four-wheelers and going hunting and stuff like that. And I'm just always outdoors when the weather is good enough to be outdoors. And even when it's not good enough, I'll typically grab my snowboard and go do something like that. So yeah, Australia is the kind of place that when I was there, I thought, this is nice. I'm driving a car. It's not an overpopulated area where it's so dense that you have trouble getting around or finding your own personal space in a park or something like that. And I really enjoyed it. The people there are lovely. They're very friendly. And the culture is I don't know. I guess, I get the humor down there. I'll say that much. So I fit right in on that level.
Cool. Yeah. I'm originally from Calgary, Canada, and I can't really compare it, but it seems like a lot of areas of the Midwest of America where, I don't know, there's not maybe as much to do. When I moved down here, I was just sort of astounded at all the outdoor activities and the lifestyle of the country. And, that's in Australia, but I've also been to Singapore as well, and we'll be back through there shortly. How do you sort of contrast the change between, being from Cincinnati and now being, one of the mega cities of the globe?
Yeah. It's interesting being here in Singapore for me, because this is, when I first came to Singapore, the first trip I ever made here, I thought, man, this is so populated. There's such little space here. But then when you leave Singapore and you travel to a place like Bangkok or Manila or Jakarta, where a city is densely populated to an X factor of what this is populated, and you come back to Singapore, you suddenly realize, wow, I actually have space here. Singapore's done a great job in the design of this country, down from everything from the amount of greenery that they put in to the technology to the engineering of the roadway and railway systems to get around, public transportation. Like, thought was put into every single thing that they did at a level to make this place run as efficiently as possible. For me, living in Singapore is much different than the Midwest life. It's there are so many things that I would be able to do on a daily basis in the Midwest that I just can't do here. And so that's a bit of an adjustment for me. But when you think about living places, Singapore is one of the safest places you can live. It's very clean. The people are friendly, and you don't have problem getting the things that you need here. So from that perspective, this is a good transition. It's the first time I've ever lived outside of the country. And this was a nice way to go about it. I'm not in the middle of Siberia, trying to figure out how I'm going to find a gym to work out in, or my protein powder or something like that.
Cool. One of the things I wanted to ask you about that is, during your career, as I mentioned, you were branded as a Millitech fighter, but you actually came out of Cincinnati, and you go over there and train for camps, and you're working with George Dragel. Now, I had read on your Wikipedia page, after the Anderson fight, you moved over to train with Matt Hume, and I know that he's been pretty tied to the one brand for a long time. Was he or any of these other guys an introduction into that into the organization, or how did the opportunity present itself?
Yeah, actually, so I've always trained in Cincinnati. It's been my home base. And throughout my career, particularly when I started competing professionally at a lower level, there were much smaller shows in the States at that time. A gentleman by the name of Monty Cox started managing me, and Monty was tied into the Millitech camp. He's managed several champions. And so Cincinnati is about, about a 7-hour drive from where the Millitech camp is located in Iowa. And I would just make frequent trips up there. And I would do this I would do a week or a 2-week camp to learn new things, to gauge myself, to see how my progress was going. They were much more experienced in the fight game at the time than I was. And so it was basically about just improving the depth of who I was as an athlete. And I did that for some time. But then as my resources started to build, as the landscape of the entire industry started to change, Cincinnati became a bit more of a hotbed of good athletes. George Dragel was a black belt at the time. He may have been the only black belt in the jiu-jitsu black belt in Cincinnati at the time. And slowly but surely, this core group of training partners that I had started coming together. And of course, now the landscape of even Cincinnati is different. There are several black belts in the city and several successful mixed martial arts schools as well that have produced some good athletes out of the area. But I was doing my thing until I lost my belt to Anderson. Now, the decision to work with Matt Hume wasn't a dissatisfaction with my camp or my coaches at the time. I had some amazing coaches down in Cincinnati, and I continued working with them. I would actually make frequent trips up to Seattle, Washington, where Matt's school was, and take my boxing coach, Rob Radford, up there with me at the time to help me run portions of my camp. And really working with Matt was all about just getting an outside perspective of what the things I was doing well, or perhaps the things that I wasn't doing well in my camp at the time. And go ahead. Oh, well, I was going to say, then Matt and I, at one point, we had traveled down to Singapore to do a seminar down here at Evolve. And after being here at Evolve, we had met some of the people that were developing One Championship at the time. And there was talk about if I was ever interested in a job in the future, that they would be interested in working with me. And so as time progressed and my career started to wind down and I retired, the talks continued, and I ended up with a position here at One Championship. Now, Matt had already we had developed relationships, and Matt, if you know anything about Matt's history with Pancrase and Pride and everything that he's done on this side of the planet, he was a natural fit for what was going on over here. So he pretty much from the ground up has kind of built this organization's athlete competition side of the business.
He's an interesting character because, from my understanding, or what I've read online, is that he's pretty involved with the organization and their dealings and sort of a connection to North America. And where I'm using this as a segue is, I don't even know how many months ago it was now, but this is probably one of the more significant MMA contractual deals that we saw, where there was a swap with Askren and Demetrius Johnson into the organization. Can you, first of all, give us just a little bit of insights into how that was possible? But then also, in the Asian market, are guys like Mighty Mouse and Eddie Alvarez, do they have name recognition over there?
They do. Interestingly enough, well, let me back up and say this. Matt is the matchmaker for One Championship. And he is kind of the bridge on the athlete side of things between North America and, of course, Asia, I guess you could say. How that trade came about, how the negotiation of that trade came about, I'm not sure. I know that Askren was basically at the end of his career here. He had announced retirement and expressed some interest in competing in One Championship solely, or competing in the UFC solely because of different names that he was looking at competing against. The same with Demetrius Johnson. Demetrius was in his contract and had interests in other areas. So I don't know the details of that trade because it's just not part of the business dealings. I didn't sit in on any of those meetings. I'm busy running my own project. But there was a trade made, and I don't know the finances or any of the details of those kinds of things. That's a good question for Matt. He would be more educated on that matter. But yeah, talking about guys like Eddie and Demetrius, they are going to have star power over here in name recognition, particularly with just how international the mixed martial arts industry is at this point in time. When I first started working over here, I was quite surprised at how often I was recognized, particularly when I initially came to Asia. I remember the first time I was in Manila, I did not realize the kind of fan base I had in the Philippines. And I was taken aback by it. So even myself, and it's been several years since I've been inside the cage, I sometimes find it quite surprising how often I'm recognized.
With, I mean, we're saying Asian. Both you and I recognize that Asia, it's a continent plus. It's 50 countries that make it up, so it's hard to describe. But did you have any, I guess, culture shock, or what have been the impressions? Because for people that aren't regular viewers of one, you guys travel from country to country. It's really a touring, full combat show with different disciplines. What's sort of the impression that you've had, moving around that area of the world?
Well, I don't know. This is kind of, in order for me to properly answer this question, I think I would have to put myself in the mindset of the individual who hadn't been to that many countries. I've traveled to about 50 countries at this point in my life, and it's quite difficult to culturally shock me, so to speak. I'll tell you one story. I remember the first time I went to Myanmar, and in Myanmar, their traditional martial art is called Lethwei. You can do a little research on Lethwei, or the listeners can if they're not familiar with it.
Kickboxing stuff, isn't it? Like the wrapped hands type stuff.
Yeah. They wrap their hands with a gauze,
don't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They wrap their hands with a gauze type of wrap, and it's for all intents and purposes like Cambodia has Khmer boxing. Lethwei is indigenous to Myanmar. Thailand has Muay Thai, and these styles, they're very similar, a very similar kind of style of kickboxing. But when you go to Lethwei, when you go to Myanmar, what's unique to Lethwei is the fact that the athletes are allowed to headbutt in that sport. And it's quite an adjustment when you watch that the first time. I remember seeing that, and this is not one of those instances where you see athletes that'll clinch and maybe just kind of throw a head in there. They'll actually throw a combination where the head is part of the combination. Instead of throwing a 1-2-3 combination, they might throw a 1-2 headbutt combination. And I remember seeing that from the martial arts side and just kind of sitting in the audience, scratching my head, thinking, whoa, this is insane. As you become educated about that sport, because my mind is conditioned to think that headbutts are just, they're illegal in mixed martial arts. You can't use them in this sport. So I would imagine that my thought process was very similar to people who have watched mixed martial arts for the first time, just in complete disbelief of what they're watching. But as you watch a martial art like Lethwei and you see how these athletes incorporate the head movement into their hand combinations, it really does change the dynamic of that sport. It's quite interesting. I've been to Myanmar several times and watched many traditional Lethwei bouts. And interestingly enough, how the head is used, it's not as, I guess when you think of something like that, a word like brutal might come to mind, but it's just not, it's not what you think it is. And once you start watching that art, you see it for something different than it is. So I'm not as culturally shocked anymore by something like that because I've been exposed to it enough.
Okay. And what, with ONE FC, we'll probably talk about that in a second as well, but in terms of, as a sport, you guys have sort of gone down more of, I think did Strikeforce used to do it as well, where there's not just MMA, you guys also do Thai boxing with MMA gloves and a few sort of different disciplines. What's sort of the business strategy of not being involved in just one form of combat?
I think that when you're on this side of the planet, you have different forms of combat. Like I just explained, there are different forms of combat that are indigenous to every region here, and people want to see these kind of matchups. When I'll be honest, when one first talked about doing a card that had mixed martial arts bouts as well as kickboxing bouts or Muay Thai bouts, my initial reaction was, no. I'm here to see a mixed martial arts event. And then as I saw the first couple cards unfold, I started looking at these things and I thought, well, this is quite interesting. I actually get really excited now about seeing some of these Muay Thai matches, for example. And so I believe that what we're doing appeals to the fan base more.
Interesting. As well, you guys recently went through a slight name change. It used to be One FC up until very recently, and it's now One Championship. Do I have that correct?
Yeah.
Is there a reason behind that in terms of branding or where you guys see yourselves headed?
I think it's just cleaner. Yeah.
Okay. Look, let's talk a little bit about your fighting back in the day and when you got into it. Probably for a lot of people who might have watched years ago, they know the story. But at the time, you were sharing the role. You were, I think, a high school. Was it a math teacher that you were at the time before you went?
Correct.
Pro?
Yes.
Do you want to just give us into a bit of insights around that time? As I mentioned, we spoke with Jeff Sherdog a few weeks ago, and he was explaining to us about how Monty Cox was managing a lot of fighters around this time and building them up and helping to bring them into the UFC. But it certainly wasn't the beast that it is these days. Do you want to, I guess, just take us through a little bit of the scene when you were coming up?
Yeah, no, the industry was way different. My dealings with Monty Cox, Monty and I had a handshake agreement on our management, and he managing and his management of me. And I'm the kind of person that I really like to be able to do business on a handshake agreement. I don't like arguing over dollars on different things. I would not cut a friend out of my social circle in order to save $1. And we never had a disagreement on anything. And I like doing business with people that I can be that way with. The complexity of this industry has exponentially increased since 2001 or 2002, whatever year it was that Monty started managing me. So it's become quite complex and much more difficult to have those kind of relationships, I'm sure. I'm glad that I was in this industry at a time that I was. I was also in the industry at a time where things weren't established. I was competing in the United States at times where people were referring to mixed martial arts as human cockfighting. And it took educating not only policymakers, but the fans in general about the sport, how that it's not exactly what you think it is. I mean, martial arts in general, it doesn't really matter whether you're doing traditional Muay Thai match or if you're doing a mixed martial arts match or if you're doing a jiu-jitsu competition. When you're doing martial arts, it truly is a physical chess match. You're thinking as much as you are moving as well. And you have to make intelligent movements every single time or you're going to find yourself checkmated very quickly. But I came into the industry at the time where things were on shaky grounds. I was teaching high school. I had gone to college to earn my both undergraduate degrees in mathematics and secondary education, and I went on to further my undergrad degree in education to get my master's degree while I was teaching. I taught 4 years full time, and then when I quit teaching full time, I still worked at an at-risk program for the next 2.5 years. I worked at that at-risk program several nights a week just to kind of earn some money, but also keep myself in that industry because I'm very passionate about teaching. And I worked in that at-risk program all the way up until about a week and a half outside of my title fight in June of that year when the school year ended. And I knew that when the school year ended that I was no longer going to be able to come back. After that, I went and coached the Ultimate Fighter, and then life just completely went a different direction. I was way too busy to be teaching high school at that point in time. But if you rewind the clock back a couple years prior to that, there was a point in time where I told my father that I wanted to quit my job as a math teacher, to quit my career, something that I invested years in going to university for, in order to pursue a career athletically in an industry at the time that wasn't established. And so when I told my father this, he was more than distraught about the entire situation. He was actually, my father and I, my dad was a gentleman who went back to school late in life, and he and I graduated from the university in Cincinnati at the same year. He was very proud of me going to school for that. And I was, I'm one of many siblings. I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and I'm the only child in my family to have graduated from college. And that was a big deal to my dad. And so for me to just, in his eyes, throw all that away, particularly for sport that wasn't fully established at the time. If you put yourself at that point in history, he was not happy with me. Now, of course, when you fast forward the clocks, and my dad had attended one of my title defenses in Las Vegas, I can distinctly remember us having dinner together and my dad telling me how proud he was of me at that time. And that meant the world to me. But this development of the industry over the years, many people in this modern age forget about that. In North America, in the days of, people like the Conor McGregors or the Ben Askrens for one championship or something like that, people forget how unstable this industry was many years ago.
Where did you think it was going to take you at the time? Because I remember that. So I remember a period where it was no longer on pay-per-view and it wasn't even accessible because I was living in Canada, so you needed direct TV. And that's sort of what predicated the onset of the internet and all these, tape trading. Were you just sort of riding it and saying, oh, look, I'll take another fight and we'll see where we go? Or at what point did it become something that you thought that you could do?
I was young. I was in my mid-20s at the time, and I didn't really think about where it would take me. I didn't think about things like longevity. An athlete, a 25, 26, 27-year-old athlete who believes they're indestructible at that point in time of their life, don't think about things like longevity. You don't think about things like smart business decisions. You don't think about things like 401ks, retirement plans, or benefits, or healthcare benefits, and things like that. I was a young guy. I had been an athlete my entire life. I started sports when I was probably like the age of 7 and flipping between American football and baseball and basketball and growing up playing sports like that my whole life. And I tried tons of different sports. I played what we call soccer one year. I was on the swim team one or 2 years as a kid and just tried my hand at many things. But as most young kids do, I grew up dreaming of being a professional athlete. And my number one love was American football. I wanted nothing more than to earn a scholarship for a major university and then play that sport professionally. Unfortunately, or I guess I should say fortunately for me, God did not bless me with the skills and physical gifts that I needed to play that game. I'm not an explosive athlete like that. I'm a different kind of athlete. But I do have the tools that are necessary for this sport. And it was clear, it was very apparent to me when I first started training martial arts that I had a quick learning curve for this sport and was going to have a much higher rate of success here than I would in any other sport. Unbeknownst to me, I had no clue that in no way, shape, or form was I thinking when I first started training that I was going to pursue a career professionally in this. It wasn't until later. But even when I quit my career teaching and began to pursue this, I wasn't pursuing I just thought, let's just see what happens and let's have fun with this while we can, while I'm young. When I quit my job at the high school where I was teaching, I actually tried to take a sabbatical because I thought this is probably something I'll do for a year or two, but I'll end up coming back to my career. And I didn't want to lose my status within my school district because I had earned some seniority with the few years that I was teaching there. And the school looked at me and they said, let me get this straight. You want to take a sabbatical for fighting? That's not what sabbaticals, they basically had a good laugh about it. So, in my mindset at the time was just, let's just see where this takes me in the near future.
Cool. As you're coming up, you end up training or at least prepping for the fights with the Millitech team. During the broadcast, you were billed as a Millitech fighter. I can't remember if we were talking about that before, but you were primarily fighting out of Cincinnati and preparing for your fights through Millitech. A lot of people listening will not understand or know how dominant the Millitech camp was around this time. I mean, prior to having super camps, this was the camp at the time where you had, Lawler, Sylvia, and a whole bunch of other guys. How did you get involved in them? And tell us a little bit about your relationship and working with Pat and his team.
Well, I got involved with them. Let's see. Let me back this up. I had taken a match for an organization. Which organization did I compete for? IFL? No, not IFL.
This would predate that, I think. I've got your shirt on.
That.
We've got. I'm going to ask you about that because you end up in between UFC fights. You go over to fight Machida as well. But we've got Inoki, Boombaya, and there's an SB35, AFC1 Battleground.
Prior to that, who was ruled as my no contest? It was Aaron Brink. What organization was that? I forget.
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. That's IFC.
IFC. That's what it was, not IFL, IFC. So this is when, what was the date on that? Do you have it?
Jan 13, 2001. Accidental foot injury.
Yeah, you can watch that. You can actually watch that match. It was ruled as a victory and then subsequently ruled as a no contest. It should not be a no contest on my record, but either way, it's not important to me. The sun will still set tonight, and I'll still get up tomorrow and put my pants left leg on first.
That's a name I haven't heard. The story of Aaron Brink is pretty devastating. It's odd that you mentioned that name.
Yeah, well, because this was a pivotal point in my career, actually. This is when Monty actually started managing me. What happened was I had met Monty. I don't know how I met Monty, through shows, and I had competed for him several times before on different cards. And he had lined up a few matches for me here and there because people needed fill-ins. He wasn't managing me, but he knew that I was a worthy opponent for other people. And I'm sure at the time he was just saying, well, I have a guy in this part of the country that we can use for fill-in here. So this all culminated to the point where I'm fighting for the IFC title against Aaron Brink. Now, Aaron is a California located guy. I'm located in Cincinnati, which is many, many, many miles away. And it was not in the organization's best interest to fly somebody like me out there to beat their champion. But lo and behold, I did. I was sick that night for the fight. So sick that 2 hours before the event started, I was laying in my hotel bed sweating of fever with almost 105-degree fever. You can go back and watch the video, and you could tell if you look at that video, you could tell that I'm not well. And it's the first time in my career that I had been flown to an event by an organization. Every other event that I competed in, I would drive to places like Nebraska or Cleveland or wherever to compete in these smaller shows. But this event was the first time I flew there, and I didn't know what to do, so I went ahead and I competed with nearly 105, like 104.7 fever or something. And Monty was there. Monty was in my hotel room prior to, and I went ahead and competed. And then he called me a few days later and just said, he said to me, Rich, you're a good guy. I really like you. And I saw you make one of the dumbest decisions I've ever seen an athlete make in their career. And I would like to manage you if you're interested. So at the time, I did not understand the significance of this offer and what it could do for my career. So I was very nonchalant about it and like, well, I'll let you know. I'll get back to you. There were so many guys at the time that would have been just calling him on a daily basis to get him to manage them, because Monty had managed. I can't even think of all the guys he's managed. Robbie Lawler,
everyone in
Pat
Southern
Millitech.
California though as well, doesn't he? Like they pretty had everyone in that sort of late '90s, early 2000 period.
Exactly, and at the time he was also managing a guy by the name of Jeremy Horn, and many people probably have forgotten this name, but I know that I'm being inducted into the Hall of Fame as a pioneer. But you want to talk about a pioneer. Jeremy Horn was one of those guys. He was light years ahead. His jiu-jitsu was light years ahead of the industry at the time. But he was probably one of the few people I knew that was rolling at near black belt level in the United States when everybody else was white and blue belts at best. And this guy had defeated Chuck with I think an arm triangle maybe in I don't know, maybe.
Well, I remember that because I trained with in BJJ at the time when they were still together. I trained with Elvis Sinisic and Anthony Perosh. I think that was Elvis's first fight in the UFC, and then I was one of the guys going back when they brought Jeremy back into the UFC. I was one of the only guys I knew who thought that he'd be able to handle Chuck. It certainly didn't go that way in that fight, but
but you got to remember. So they fought twice, but Jeremy fought him in like UFC 19 and beat him. I think it was an arm triangle that he.
I've got that on VHS. That's like Young Guns when Boss was still around. I think Boss is in 18 or 20 or something. Yeah.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, at the time, I was still training on my own when I watched that match, and I can remember. Funny you mentioned VHS, but I can remember watching that match on VHS when you could like slow motion rewind and slow motion play VHS tapes. Man, there's probably many of your listeners that wouldn't even know how to operate a VCR.
These tapes that I've got, because they didn't really sell them publicly, so I would have to go into a Blockbuster Video and ask to buy them off the shelf. So the majority of my collection still has the blue Be Kind Rewind sticker on them.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Or you know what you would do? You would ask to buy them, and then Blockbuster would say no, so then you would just rent it and never return it and just pay the fee for it. You'd be like, okay, I just bought. Like, you're not going to sell it to me? Fine, I'll just keep it. Oh, how much was this tape that I quote unquote lost? lost. Sorry about that.
But I remember you could do that because they would have you go into there, and as long as the cassette, you'd have to wait for them to go off a bit. But if the cassette hadn't been rented for something like 120 days, they'd put it on for like $10 or something.
Yeah. I used to love making a Friday afternoon, early evening out of just go. You can go to Blockbuster or whatever and just stand in that video store. It would take you longer to select a video than it would to actually watch the movie.
Because I've got all these like old King of the Cage tapes too. Before they started packaging them in like 10-pack DVDs with trying to remember who some of the guys out of there. A whole bunch of guys out of Shamrock's camp and Vernon Tiger White and all these guys. Really.
Oh yeah.
Vernon
White, man. Dude, I got stories about some of these guys. Like I saw Vernon White compete for the WFA when I fought Marvin Eastman, and he had run over his foot with a lawnmower and cut off like 2 of his toes or mashed them up with the blades of the lawnmower and still competed.
Jeremy Bolander, that's who the other guy I remember from all those cassettes.
And this was at a time where you could still wear wrestling shoes. So he just put on his wrestling shoes, and the doctors would never see any of that kind of stuff. Like that was the landscape of mixed martial arts early in my career.
Well,
where you could do these kinds of things.
Who was the big guy? Mike, I can't remember his name. He fought at heavyweight, and he'd always fight in a tank top. Mike, bald head.
And then Whitehead.
And then King of the Cage, they had that one. There's still GIFs floating of it online when they tried to do that outdoor show, and it was pouring down rain outside, and the guys were just like a slip and slide out there. It was, I've got all this stuff sitting on these collections before someone started showing me Pride stuff.
Yeah, so Monty ran a show called Extreme Challenge. He still does, I think, and so that's where I got some of my experience, and I think I competed for him several times prior to the IFC event with Aaron Brink. But it was at that point that Monty started managing me, and of course, Jeremy and I think we had overlapped. This is probably me, I can't exactly remember, but he and I probably overlapped on a few events, and I got to just know him and chatting with him and everything. And at the time, he really took me under his wing. At a point where I was in Cincinnati training. This is before I had any kind of relationship with George and just doing everything on my own. So when I would go up to the Millitech camp here and there, I would do a lot of work with Jeremy, and he was slick, man. He was, like I said, light years ahead of the competition at the time. And, most people would forget about him tapping out a guy like Chuck, earlier in his career. But you can look at Jeremy's Sherdog, and you'll see the who's who on his Sherdog of guys that he's beaten as well. He, defeated Chael Sonnen, I think, a couple times with a triangle choke, and just there's a whole list of people. It's been a long time since I've looked at his record, but very accomplished athlete. And so, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, for the guys that don't know, like there are. I mean, for lack of a better term, journeymen who fight all the time, and there are guys that pad their records. Like this, I found out this weekend, Shannon Rich and Travis Fulton fought each other, which are names I haven't heard of in like 2 decades.
I fought Travis Fulton.
When was that? Is this UFC?
No, it was Rings. I fought. He and I competed against each other in rings.
But I saw it on one of the forums, and they billed it as like the only fight where 2 guys have a combined record of more than 400 fights, something like that. But Jeremy's he's up in like the 90 fight numbers or something, isn't he? But he against
he might be. I think he's over 100, man.
Is he? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I believe so.
But he was really like, in the era of like the underground and MMA TV, he was like a demigod around that time. He was very well known and respected by everyone on the scene.
And at the time, man, I remember meeting him, and I remember the first time I grappled with Jeremy, and just one of those. He's one of those guys that when I get to get on the mat with him, I just remember thinking like how blessed I was to have a resource like that. And he was such a nice guy, and just always willing to help me out. And when I look back at it now and I think about where I was and where he was talent-wise, the fact that he put all that time into me when I would come to the Millitech camp was amazing. I mean, Pat, everybody at that camp was great. They all spent time with me. Even Matt Hughes spent quite a bit of time with me at the time. But Jeremy was just one of those guys who took the extra time to go ahead and make sure that I was progressing as an athlete. And so he and I had formed a really good friendship.
113 fights, it says he's got there when I look him up on ShareDog.
There you go.
I remember hearing stories that he would take fights for friends for free just to help fill their cards on weekends. And
yeah, he competed in Cincinnati for us one time, and he competed against a local guy in Cincinnati that was not an easy, this was like not some sort of like gimme kind of win. And he came down and competed for a friend of mine that was running the organization, basically just for gas money and hotel. I was like, just pay for my way to get down there and I'll help you out.
Yeah, right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What came out of the next thing? Like, Tim went on and became a police officer, but I had heard some rumblings that Robbie Lawler ended up having a fallout with Pat, which set up, because Robbie and Matt went off and created, was it Hit Gym or something along those lines? Do you know anything about what happened there?
No, not really. First of all, I'll just say this. I always steer clear of any kind of drama, with that kind of stuff, because I never had, when I look at these guys, like I never had any issues with Pat. Like Pat, I would still consider Pat a friend. If Pat reached out to me, and said, "Hey, Rich, I need this favor," and it was something that I was capable of doing for him, then I would do it. Same with Robbie. As a matter of fact, I just had recently spoken to Robbie. Same with obviously Jeremy or Jens or Tim Sylvia, or, I consider all these people friends. So any kind of animosity that had developed between any of them, and I really don't even know about any of it, because like I said, I was only going up there for camps at the time. I just steer clear of any of that stuff. I don't know anything about it, and I maintain my friendships with everybody.
Okay, fair enough. Well, what do you think? Well, I guess it's impressive in and of itself. Lawler's another one of the guys that I really admire, and I was speaking to Tim Kennedy last week, and I was saying, like, he sort of fell off the map for a while. He got cut from the UFC and was going through all these organizations, but the story of his revival and ascent to a UFC championship after sort of being in the wilderness is. It's really a Cinderella man story. I mean, the guy well. Do you reckon he changed anything, or do you reckon he was just going down the same path? Because there's, in addition to him being able to do that, I've read stories about him saying, like, he had to give up sparring because he's been in so many battles that he has, severe headaches, I think, from doing a lot of this stuff, and his route back to the top, and it makes me wonder now why he's continuing to fight and taking these sorts of fights that he's doing when he is a living legend now by what he's done.
Yeah. Okay. I met Robbie when he was 18 or 19. He was a young kid. One of the first times I came up to Millitech camp, and he's a southpaw like me. And I'll tell you what, pound for pound, he's probably in sparring one of the hardest guys I've ever been hit by. I can just remember the first time I sparred with him, and he stuck me with a good left cross, and I just thought, like, whoa, I'm in for a long day. And that was one of the things about the Millitech camp, man. They were a school of hard knocks. Like, you came there to bang, and it was a known thing. So he grew up in that environment, and that's the problem oftentimes with competition, is that a lot of these guys, they take. You think about it this way. I think I broke this down in the TED talk that I did, but for every minute that I'm scheduled to be in the arena, if during competition, I spend about 8 hours preparing for each minute. That's what the mathematics works out to. So you think about, for every minute of abuse, I'm in the ring. You want to call it abuse? I'm just going to use that word. For every minute of I don't want to use the word abuse, but for every minute of stress I put my body through in the ring, I'm putting my body through 8 hours of stress and preparation. So if you're taking a lot of shots to the head, or if you're not intelligent about things like concussions during training and stuff like that, this stuff, it'll catch up with you, especially in this modern era where we know more about the brain than we did during my era of growing up. I grew up in an era of rub some dirt on and get back in the game. So yeah, but the problem you have is that when you're in this mix, and you talk about the resurgence of somebody like Robbie Lawler, I don't think it's a resurgence as much. I don't think he fell off the map and changed anything and made himself a different athlete. I think that careers are oftentimes a lot about momentum. And once that momentum starts going, you'll see success on the business side of things. But when I look at Robbie as an athlete, from the time that kid was 18, I knew that he was destined to be something great in this industry. I knew that he was going to make waves. But you talk about like, why do people keep doing that? And it's the nature of man. We're competitive creatures by nature, and there's, until your body physically won't allow you to do something, you're just going to keep doing it, particularly when you're in a young mindset. As you get older and you start realizing, I'm not recovering as quickly, these pains are not going away, the damage that I've done is permanent, and I'm talking about things like knees or elbows or something like that. That's one thing. But when you do permanent damage to a head, that becomes a scary thing.
So I was going to have you suffered from any, because a lot of the way that people are training now is starting to change, where heavy sparring is really only reserved maybe a few weeks out, but it's not really practice anymore. Have you noticed that, or have you had any ill effects? Because you've suffered a few pretty bad knockouts yourself.
Yeah. I think I've counted 8 concussions in my career, both on the winning and losing side, because I've been dropped a couple times in winning when I'm winning matches. So yeah, I've obviously suffered my concussions before. I can't think of any significant time ever when I was training that I don't think I've ever been dropped in training ever. There have probably been a couple times where maybe I got clipped pretty decently in the head and kind of shook it out like, ooh, man, that one got me. But, and didn't think much of it earlier in my career. Of course, as my career developed and we started learning more about the head, I realized like, hey, that's not smart either. I always took the most intelligent and informed approach that I possibly could to my training at the time. Obviously, I was a much more intelligent athlete at 35 than I was at 25. But even at 25, I was the athlete that was out there reading literature, studying things, making the best decisions I could on things like rehab and recovery and taking care of your body, which is why my body is in pretty good shape after having a near 15-year career professionally in this sport. But that's the thing, some of these guys, they just don't know how to take care of themselves. But the philosophy is changing in certain camps, but in other camps, they don't know any better.
We'll start getting into some of the guys that you fought and around that, but you've touched on it, so we might as well explore that. We've discussed it a bit. A lot of fighters don't know when it's time to give up the game, or alternately, because of their drive in it, they don't have any security or backup plan to what they do, and they start falling into that well beyond 35 age. When did you have a realization? What made you decide that, okay, it's time for me to move on to something else?
Heck no, man. I'm 44 years old and I still think that I can compete. It's just the way that the competitive mind works. I'm at this age now where I realize I cannot compete consistently. My body just can't keep up. I won't recover quick enough. I won't whatever quick enough. It just won't happen. But I do believe in my mind that I could still compete within the upper echelon on occasion. I believe that I could do a camp here and a camp there kind of thing. And that's at this age. Now, granted, I did notice things start to change for me at the age of 35. I wasn't recovering as quickly from workouts and all that kind of stuff. But I had talks with my coaches. I said, hey, look, you guys, you're not going to hurt my feelings. If it gets to the point where you're watching me do pad work or you're watching me sparring and you want to just pull me aside and say, look, Rich, you're losing a step here. Tell me. And my coaches never one time said that to me. And I believe that if I was to decide to ever take a come out of retirement match and step into the ring at this point in time, I wouldn't look like the shadow of a man I once was. That's what I'm going to say. I would compete and people would be like, man, Rich he's still sharp. And when people see me, you can tell that I keep myself in shape. And when I'm grappling or I'm in the gym sparring or stuff like that, like it's clear that I'm not, that I just haven't regressed that much. Now, granted, I'm not a 25-year-old athlete anymore. And I know this, like logically I know this, but my brain will still tell me, nah, you can do that. You can still do that.
Well, look, we're discussing some of the personalities around the sport. One of the guys that's very, very interesting to me, and again, while Millitech Fighting was around, one of the other big teams was Team Quest around the time. Mm-hmm. It was Randy Couture is probably still is my favorite fighter.
Oh, okay, I'm gonna hang up this phone right now because I like Randy, but I was supposed to be your favorite fighter for this call.
Sorry, you are. Sorry, we'll just cut that out of the broadcast. But the guy that I really wanted to ask you about, because I was a big fan of, and the stories around him, I mean, some of them aren't pleasant, but the Evan Tanner fight. I was told that, that they said on the Evan Tanner got into it by watching the VHS instructionals. It was a pretty one-handed fight. You pretty much beat Evan down. He couldn't get you to the ground. But I wanted to know if you ended up finding anything about him personally, because there was a lot of information that I would read about him afterwards, that he was a drunk, he was a loner, he was very selfish in training, and a lot of the stuff that you don't find out about the personalities of athletes very much.
Yeah. I know Evan was a loner for sure. Like he was kind of like one of those lone wolf kind of guys. As far as, and I know he had issues with drinking because I'd spoken to some of his friends before. But you don't witness these things. You got to realize the industry, it's a small community, particularly in that day, right? So you get to know everybody. Guys that you've competed against, guys that you haven't competed against, you cross each other's paths, you say hello, you get to chatting for a couple minutes here and there. But the reality is I'm going to chat with Evan, a few minutes every couple months when I cross paths with him at a show. And that's all the better I got to know him. He was always super respectful to me all the way down to the end of his career when I knew him. But yeah, he was known for being kind of a by himself, do it by himself kind of guy. I don't know how that applied in his camps or anything, because I've never been to Team Quest for a training session and never witnessed any of his training sessions, but he was that way, which was, I guess, kind of manifested in the way that he ended up passing by going on that. He went on that expedition on the motorcycle out into the desert. Yeah. By himself. And of course he ran out of supplies and it ended up that's what ended up taking his life. But that was something that he did alone. Something like that kind of explore, like that expedition sounds like something I'd be interested in doing, but I wouldn't want to do that on my own. First of all, it would just, not from a safety perspective, although that's the intelligent thing, is to do it with somebody, but more of that. I would rather do that and share that experience with a person, be it one of my friends or whoever. And so, yeah, he had that reputation, but Evan was always cordial, nice and friendly to me. And I have nothing but positive things to say about him. He was a tough competitor. And I'll say this, Jesse, I don't know if I would call that entire match one-sided, because in the title match, was it the end of the first round or end of the first round, he dropped me. And I didn't even know where I was for the second, third, and fourth round. I was just kind of on autopilot.
I haven't seen that fight in years, but I remember when he came in, because again, you were more of the polished kickboxer, and he was still using a bit more dirty striking to get the fight to the ground. And a lot of those Team Quest guys were using clinch work. And I remember it because, if I'm not mistaken, that was the first fight or the only fight that he came out with those cornrows, I think, which is I think what I remember. And then you'd beaten up his face pretty bad. And I remember he got to you by fighting, I think, was it David Terrell, who was supposed to be the big guy of that era? And I remember he just jammed him in the cage and just hammered on him. And I guess there's times when you get to see fighters break, and I think that was quite evident of what happened to him before he came up to you. But I remember, in the fight, by the time that you guys had fought, his face was it almost resembled a lot of that stuff that we're seeing in bare knuckle fighting, or bare knuckle, the new organization that's popping up. Why don't we use that as another opportunity? When I mentioned this fight with David Terrell, the second part of your career, these super fights are amazing. There's probably very few guys who have had the opportunity to go through this. Outside of talking about what your favorite moments and stuff are there any? You're sort of flying on autopilot when you're fighting, but are there any particular moments where you remember during a fight where you sort of went, "Oh, I've got him," or he's starting to wither, or he's breaking, or you found some sort of, insight where you were able to turn the match or specifically turn it into your advantage?
No, you can tell by a man's posture. You can see there are many moments where suddenly the round ends, or maybe you hit somebody with a certain punch or whatever. But oftentimes, like when a round ends, watch athletes in their body language when a round ends. They start walking back to their corner. If the camera stays on them, even now, you can see a guy that he'll walk back to his corner, and you can tell he looks defeated. And there are many times where because that was my style. For me, taking a lot of these super fights that you call them, many of them only end up being 3-rounders. For example, my match with Forrest Griffin was only a 3-round fight.
So you're going for attrition. You're just going to pressure them for.
But I would have been better off with 5-rounders all the time.
Right, okay.
Every time that I only had a match that was 3 rounds, I was like, 15 minutes is just not enough time to really grind somebody, because I was one of the few athletes in the sport that really utilized like my jab, for example. The jab is one of the most underutilized tools in mixed martial arts, but it's not a power tool. So I'm not there lining up big shots. I'm there to jab, grind you. Whether we end up in a clinch, I'm just going to grind you down. And there comes a time in the match with any of the matches that I won where you can see somebody walk back and just have that look of like, man, this guy, he doesn't get tired, or whatever they're thinking, but you can see the posture of defeat. And at that point in time, but there's still no guarantee that you're going to win that match, because you can get caught with anything. My last match against Kung, I remember at one point in time in that match, I kind of started settling into my rhythm and feeling really good with my timing. And then the next thing I know, I'm in my locker room like, what happened?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was quite brutal just for the shot that was taken, but it just looked odd because it didn't look like he had the reach or anything on you. And I think I can't remember if he was southpaw or orthodox, but it looked like he just fired that right or that rear hand sort of out of the blue. Well, he absorbed your kick or something. Is that what happened? I think.
Yeah, it was off of a kick, and then he countered to the kick. And I think, I don't know if he purposely threw an off-speed punch, but I think I tried to parry the punch too quickly, expecting it to come in faster. And I parried, the hand came down, and he just caught me on the chin.
Yeah, right.
So, these things happen,
It certainly does. So look,
but that's at a point in time in that match where I felt good. I started settling in. And so the point is that even when you see somebody's posture break, or you see some body language, or you notice a look or something that they do where you think I've got them, man, you can never count somebody out of a match.
Well, let's talk about the Anderson fights then. You went to battle with him twice. I can't really remember at the time if he was the favorite in your first fight, but what I'd like to ask about is obviously when he got into the clinch, it looked like a very, very different fight. Clearly, you would have prepared for Muay Thai and stuff, but what were you expecting? When you fought him.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'll tell you what, a good exercise for you would be to look at my first match and my second match, because we made a lot of adjustments in the clinch work between match 1 and match 2. And the clinch wasn't the issue in the second match. Actually, I think in the second match, you could probably say I was winning the first round up until the last 10 seconds when he clipped me. And then I got dropped 10 seconds with left in the first round. And, I pretty much get carried back to my stool after that round. And then I walk out in the second round, and I always jokingly say, Anderson is difficult enough to compete against, but when you're seeing 2 of him, it makes it that much more difficult. And so that fight didn't go much distance in the second round. Yeah, the first match against him, though, I really made some mistakes with him because I'm physically much larger than he is, and I thought that I would be so much stronger in the clinch. And what I did, I would blame that on arrogance, because I didn't account for the fact that Anderson was just really good at using my own strength against me. So the moment he clinched me, it wasn't as if he felt so strong that I couldn't move. But the moment that I fought, he clinched and he kind of bent me down to the side and broke my posture. And the moment that I fought that, he would use your energy or use your strength against you. And then he would take you the other way. And what you found yourself doing is fighting this thing, but every little bit that every time you mustered up fight, you're just digging yourself in this deeper hole of quicksand, making it worse and worse. And then the knees start flying in and all that kind of stuff. And it was just, like I said, this process of quicksand that quickly ended the match. So, but we made a lot of adjustments between the first and the second match. And some of that was quite a bit of that was working with Matt Hume.
Mentally, what happens to you when you go through the loss and you know that that you're going back to fight this guy? Then, how does it affect your confidence, or what do you try to do to I guess mitigate the negative thoughts from the first?
I don't think it affected my confidence as much by the time I got back to him, because we had changed my game. I felt great about the game plan. And, I talked about this in my TED talk about losing and how to lose, like how to be a loser was the talk. And basically, there are things in life. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a physical fight, if we're talking about a fight that you have to go through, or something at a job, or some sort of setback or loss, or whatever it is, that you're going to experience these things. And a lot of people, they don't know how to deal with losses. And so this is something that I really learned how to deal with. After I lost my title to Anderson the first time, I sat in my hotel room with just a feeling of disbelief. I sat there and asked myself how this could happen, staring at the I-5 at the back of the Mandalay Bay, watching traffic drive by all night until the sun came up, pretty much motionless and soundless. Just asking myself, how could this possibly happen? Because I was on top of the world at that time and I got dethroned, and I didn't really have the tools. What I say is I didn't have the tools in my toolbox to emotionally deal with something, that loss of that kind of magnitude at the time. And it took me some time to develop that. And what ends up happening is you ask me, like, how do you mitigate these feelings? It's a matter of assessing what happened in the first match, or what happened in whatever your scenario or your situation is in life, and extracting what the useful information is from that situation, but making sure that you can emotionally release the rest of it. Because if you hold on to that stuff, it's no different than tying a cinder block to your ankle while you're trying to swim in a lake. It's just going to pull you down. And that's what ends up happening to people, is they get pulled down by these other thoughts, these thoughts that are unproductive. And so you have to have a good system of separating these things, the productive things from the unproductive things, and just cut those unproductive things loose. And most people had problems cutting the unproductive pieces loose.
Fair enough. I guess it's another question sort of about the mentality and the psyche. I can't remember if he's popped once or twice now, but Anderson has popped for illegal substances. I have a hard time understanding, I guess, Dillashaw's been done for EPO, and which ones constitute which and why they're illegal, and some come from tainted supplements, some don't, some are needle injected, all this sort of jazz. It's pretty common that the guys in Pride were let to be able to ride free, but when it's supposed to be a fair competition, what does this do to the value of the loss in your opinion of him now? You know what, man? I just skip over that thought process. You start going down the rabbit hole of was he on that stuff when he and I competed and all that? It doesn't do any good. It doesn't take the fact it doesn't take the fact away that I lost that fight. I lost that match, and I had to come home and I had to look myself in the mirror. So regardless, your mindset at the time is not going to say, yeah, but I'm not saying that he did, but let's assume that he was on something, or that he popped positive for my match. I wouldn't come home and say, yeah, but he cheated. I might be able to use that as an excuse to make myself feel better, but my mindset at the time was that I should be so good at my craft that even if somebody was cheating, I would still figure out how to defeat them. Fair enough. Okay, cool. So as I mentioned, after this, you get into some really, really interesting fights that very few people have the opportunity to play within. What happens at that point? Did you just sort of decide, I want to start having fun with what I'm doing? And also what I want to ask is, when you get involved with these guys, amongst yourself who are legit killers, do you find one tougher than the other? What sort of stuff did you learn about fighting all of these guys?
Well, so I started my career at light heavy at 205. And then I ended up dropping down to 185. And we mentioned that Evan Tanner and Dave Terrell, that was the inaugural 185-pound title match. At that time, there was kind of a race for the title because most of the athletes weren't cutting weight in those days. It was not a process that was understood. And I was one of these in-betweeners where I really was never big enough to compete at light heavy, but I was never really small enough to compete at 185. But I had mastered the art of cutting weight at that time, which is interesting to talk about because we don't allow weight cuts in one championship at all. But this was the culture of combative sports at the time. And so there was a race for this title. And of course, the organization selected Evan and Dave to compete for the 185-pound title first. So I had dropped down to this middleweight class. Then the middleweight class is established. All these athletes start coming in. After I lost to Anderson the second time, because you realize, like, after I lost the first time, there was not an immediate rematch. I competed against Jason McDonald, then I competed against Travis Lutter, and I earned my way back to the title, and then I competed against Anderson the second time. After I lost that bout the second time, the organization was pretty clear about the fact that they weren't interested in doing a rubber match. You typically don't do that when you're 0-2 against an opponent anyway. So that it kind of left me as almost like a Ronin. What do I do? I'm just a masterless samurai here wandering the countryside. And I thought about going back up to 205, which is what my initial thought process was. But when you look at matches like myself versus Forrest Griffin, for example, Forrest was so much bigger than me in that match. And that's what ended up happening, that once the culture of this sport changed to weight cutting, I think when Forrest and I competed against each other, I probably weighed in at 205 on the scales and stepped into the ring at 208, maybe 209. He probably weighed in at 205 and stepped in above 230. And that's a big size advantage to give up. And so it just got to the point where I realized, like, winning a title at 205 is going to be quite difficult for me. So between now and the end of my career, I'm just going to take these matches that are interesting to people.
When, Dan Henderson didn't start out as a knockout artist, but he certainly became one with that right hand. Wanderlei's not a technical boxer, but he would just walk up to you swarming. And then Vitor, seemingly at the age of 35, still had the same hand speed that he did when he was 18. Did any of these guys hit harder than the other? Did you find it easier to move and evade one from the other? Outside of, obviously, the Vitor fight. And
no, it's not. It's not about hitting harder or anything. They all pose. Every person that you go up against, every situation in life, it's a puzzle, and you just got to figure out the puzzle. You take my prep for Dan Henderson, for example. Dan Henderson, our game plan was to just throw left leg kicks because I was nullifying his right hand. I also knew that every time I put my left leg in the air that I was susceptible to getting hit with that right hand. And Dan, there's no mistake about this guy. You know he's going to throw the right hand. You know it's coming, and it's just a matter of whether or not you can defeat this tool. And most people cannot. I never got caught with the right hand, and our game plan was just to throw my left leg, kick his shin, kick his leg, kick his hip, kick his elbow, kick his forearm, kick his bicep, kick his ribs. Wherever that leg landed, it was just getting thrown. And I had thrown so many kicks during the camp of that for that match that I lost all the hair on my left shin. It was gone from just throwing so many kicks. So that was the game plan there. We knew the right hand was coming, and we knew it was about reading body language and timing kicks, and then throwing these kicks at a time where it shut him down. And it did. He quit throwing the right hand on me because I landed a few nice left leg kicks to the ribs and ended up subsequently breaking some of his ribs. So it did shut his right hand down a little bit, and that's why I didn't get caught with it. Wanderlei, on the other hand, he's a similar kind of problem. You got to worry about getting dropped, but it's a different kind of problem. Same kind of problem, which is different parameters. Competing against Wanderlei is like stepping into a blender once you turn it on. That thing's moving, and you better not be in the way of those blades, or they're going to chop things up, right? I mean, it's a perfect analogy. Wanderlei moves like the Tasmanian devil. If you've ever seen that cartoon as a kid, right? The Warner Brothers cartoon. And so once he gets going, it's going. So the game plan with him was to utilize the jab, stick and move, don't get greedy, no more than three punch combination at the max. Otherwise you're going to get drawn into his game. And so, it was all about, bop, bop, don't get greedy, in, out, in, out, in, out. And so you're looking for a different problem in solving a different puzzle with somebody like that. So neither one of these guys is about who hits harder, because if you get clipped, and you're down. It's as simple as that. So it's just about not being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
All right. Look, we'll begin to wrap it up. We'll come back to ONE FC. But what I hadn't realized before we glued in for the call, I was looking at your Wikipedia page, and I didn't realize that you were the founder of the American Fighter brand. And then it said that you had gone through the process of selling the majority stake to Affliction. I just wanted to ask you about learning, going from a teacher to a fighter, and now sort of fighter relations and VP. What are some of the lessons that you've learned in becoming an entrepreneur and working in the business environment?
Well, I mean, I thought you wanted to wrap this up because you just asked me a question we could write a novel about.
Okay.
I mean, seriously, it's like the things that you learn. A lot of the concepts that you learn in competition, they spread across the board, and it really doesn't matter. Look, it doesn't matter what kind of job you do in this world. It really doesn't matter. You could be an expert level concert pianist. You could be a prize boxer. You could be a CEO of a company like Coca-Cola, or so on and so forth. It could be anything. And when you look at the elements of success, like what the things that successful people need to do, the kind of things that they do, you'll find that there's some common ground. No matter what industry you're in, if you want to be successful at something, if you want to outdo the competition, or if you want to perform to the peak of your ability, there are traits that a person needs in order to do these things. Now, beyond that, what you need to be able to do is have domain expertise in that area. I'll give you an example. I also I had opened up a juice shop in Beverly Hills with a business partner, and for a couple of years, and I ended up subsequently selling that juice shop. I know this about myself. I'm passionate about nutrition. I know a lot about nutrition and healthy eating, but having a passion for something and knowing a lot about that particular thing does not make me an expert in running an F&B joint. And I had no clue how to run a food and beverage place. And so there were a lot of mistakes that were made in that business that cost me quite a bit of money and subsequently helped my decision to get out of that business, because I was just sitting there thinking, like, every time I made a decision, there's a competitor in the market that knows way better, that is way more informed about that particular market than me, that is going to move more efficiently. So it's no different really than a white belt trying to grapple a black belt in a jiu-jitsu match. It's just not going to work out. And so these concepts of what makes somebody successful, things like hard work and work ethic and smart work. I always talk about the difference between hard work and smart work. These kind of principles that make people successful, they apply across the board no matter what it is you're doing. Beyond that, you better know your stuff in that particular industry. And as long as you have domain expertise in a particular industry, if you have the traits of a successful person, you're going to be a successful person, because you're going to apply that work ethic. You're going to apply that intelligence. You're going to apply your strategies to any industry you step into.
All right. Well, let's bring this back around to ONE and how that applies with them. You've now worked on, the Americas within UFC, not in a management position, but you now have that with ONE. Where do you see the differences between the organization and organizations, and where you expect ONE to move in the near future?
Well, we always have these discussions about the difference between the East and the West, like with the fan base and stuff like that. And there's really not a whole lot of difference between the East and the West. We're in the industry of sport, right? And more importantly, ONE Championship is in the industry of telling stories. We tell amazing stories. It's just the difference between us and the competitors is how we tell our stories. We tell stories about athletes that are inspiring and uplifting, and it motivates. It motivates people. We have stories about athletes and the impact that they have on nations, and the movements that these guys can make. And that's the difference. That's the difference in our strategy and how we approach this industry as opposed to a lot of the competitors. So
what does it take to market a fighter then? You sign someone who's just there. What do you have to do to, outside of their own performance, or what we see with Conor McGregor, that's a big mouth? Is there a game plan on how you try to create awareness for ONE?
Well, first of all, I mean, we want to talk about marketing an athlete. Obviously, the athlete needs to be talented. I mean, you have to be good at your craft. You can take somebody of marginal ability and be able to mask them as a paper champ for a while, but eventually it's going to catch up. And so you have to have people that are talented. And beyond that, people have to be magnetic. That's what I call it. People often call it the X factor or the it factor or whatever it is. You have to be magnetic. People need to be drawn to you for whatever that is. Now, certain people are drawn to a guy like Conor. There's drama surrounding that guy, and he has his shtick and what he does. But there are people that are drawn to. We have a champion, Ongwan Sung. He's our middleweight champ. And he's a dual champ now, actually, but his family's originally from Myanmar, and his personality is magnetic to the point that when you talk to this guy, you want to talk to him. He has a great outlook on life, and that energy projects onto the audience, and particularly the people of Myanmar, and it gives people in a country like that hope. And so all you really have to do is tell a person's story and have them be true to who they are. And that's who he is as a person. We're not putting out some fake character or something like that. And you just have to disseminate the information. And if somebody has that magnetic personality about themselves, then people will flock to them.
Have you noticed as well, what's the impression of one in the U.S.? Does it have a footprint, or are people interested in the product over there?
I think so. I think we've just, with us not having actual physical presence in the United States at this point in time, doing events there, I think that we've already garnered a decent fan base. People are aware of things like, for example, the DJ and Ben Askren trade. This is big news to people, particularly now that we've also picked up Eddie and Sage. This is big news to people. And there are a lot of people that when these trades were made, or these acquisitions of these different athletes were made, there are people that were sitting there saying to themselves, like, well, obviously this makes sense. One is a major player. But there are also a lot of people that perhaps didn't know who we were, that thought, wait a minute, who's this major player that just came on the scene with these major acquisitions?
Mm. There's what is, I guess, I don't know if you're involved in this aspect of the business, but I read a little bit about what's going on through it in Business Insider, and I get the PR releases from some of your guys in the organization. There's still a lot of venture capital investment that's keeping the organization afloat, and I've noticed that it seems that you guys are not interested in working on TV or pay-per-view deals, but live broadcasting through YouTube. What then becomes the revenue model? Is it still just advertising, or until you build up sort of superstars to, I don't know if pay-per-view is the model, what sort of keeps the business financially viable?
Well, you have your investment strategy, and then obviously you're building up assets the entire time, be it whatever those assets are, roster, doesn't matter. And then there's going to come a period where there's monetization. And this is all about strategically making the decisions on when to pull the trigger on certain things. So the strategy that's set forth is, right now, monetization is not the top priority. That's not what the company is about. That's not what it needs to, the phrase you used was to keep it afloat. So, no, we're not in that phase of the strategy yet. And obviously you have different deals, with companies like Turner, for example, in the United States. Turner is now carrying our content, and stuff like that doesn't just happen by accident. Turner didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, you know what? What about this company over here won championship? These decisions are made for reasons, and they all play into the strategy.
And so how many, one of the things that I guess is becoming problematic with the UFC is the amount of events that they have on, and the fact that they go for like 10 hours long each time is sort of reaching saturation point. What's one strategy? How many events overall will you guys put on? And, obviously you've gone into different forms of fighting to keep it of interest, but how do you guys approach these issues?
Let me be honest. I'll just say this: the sky's the limit for one championship, because I remember several years back the company saying we want to do one event per week. And these events will mix. Some of them will be one championship events. Some of them can be one Warrior Series events, which is my project. Some of them will be one Hero Series, which is our China shows. But I just remember at the time thinking, one event a week, that's crazy. It doesn't even make sense to me. And then as this thing continues to unfold, now I see the beauty of this thing unfolding, and the amount of content that we put out, and the athletes that we've created. And now we're branching into other martial arts. And so with the fact that our roster is just becoming deeper and deeper, I've gone from the thinking of, man, that's way too many events, to how do we do more events so that we can, because the roster is getting so deep. And there's an interest for it. If you look at things like our broadcast hours and our TV ratings, everything is just exponentially jumping every year. So we have the right formula set in place. The pay-per-view market is not a big market over here. And we obviously don't want to enter. It's just a foreign concept. It's not something that's popular on this side of the planet. The people don't typically do that.
Well, the other thing I was going to ask about that is this content, and a lot of the athletes are from pretty developing nations. So I assume it's just to be able to make that product as easily accessible as possible.
Absolutely, because there's when you look at the model in the West, is hold an event, have a pay-per-view. Now you're beholden to your pay-per-view sales. Where we're just all about, let's get distribution, and then as distribution comes in, so will advertising dollars and endorsements, sponsorships, and all the other ways that you can make money financially through content distribution.
Cool. So, look, again, a lot of people will be listening to this from all areas. I'm aware of one, because you guys broadcast it live on YouTube. How can people that are interested in checking out your product do so?
It depends on where you are geographically, but the easiest way to go about this is you can go to our app, the One Super app. So you just download the One Championship app, and all of our content, past and present, is on the One Championship app. Now, if you're in the U.S. and you're listening to this, then you can go to Bleacher Report Live to get to watch the events from there.
Cool, Rich. This has been look, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and the really good back and forth. As you know, sometimes you can ask a question and get a bit of dead air, but I appreciate you sort of going in depth on this. I'll ask you one question when we're done, but other than that, I genuinely thank you for your time, and it's been a pleasure to be able to watch you compete.
Yeah, had fun, man.
Cheers.